Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to our Team Tuesday this week with Andrew Mitchell. Hey Andrew, welcome back.
Thank you, Vasco.
So Andrew, on Tuesdays we talk teams, of course, and we'll dive into the team topic in a minute. But before we go there, to share with us, what was the book that most influenced you in your career as a Scrum Master?
Yeah, thanks, Vasco. I'm going to go a little off script. I admit that I tend to lean towards reading fiction, so I don't read a lot of the books that are in your podcast that are mentioned by the other folks. But one author that I love is Simon Sinek, and I actually think Leaders Eat Last is required reading for Scrum Masters. Leaders Eat Last, the concept comes from the U.S. Marines, where literally the leadership will not dine in the mess hall ahead of the enlisted men and women. They make sure that, it's just a small metaphor to make sure that they make sure that their people are cared for. But in this book, he talks in the opening, and there's, if you want to not read the book but still learn the stories, he has some YouTubes on this story of the opening of this pilot in Afghanistan, I believe it was, and he was called to support some troops on the ground, and he ran some incredibly risky, life-threatening bombing raids to support these ground troops that were being attacked, and put his own life in jeopardy. And in the book, he's asked, "Why did you do this?" And he simply said, "Because they would do it for me." This was a group of men and women on the ground that he would probably never meet. But, it almost brings a tear to my eye to think about that level of servant leadership, that you are willing to do something because those people would do it for you, that level of trust. Anyway, I just think it's a wonderful book. It's a good read. Simon Sinek's a great writer, and I totally recommend it for Scrum Masters.
Absolutely. I don't think that this particular book has been referred to here. It might have, but I don't remember. Definitely the Start With Why, also by Simon Sinek, has been referred to here. But I really like the story of the Leaders Eat Last. So definitely a recommended book. As you said, required reading for Scrum Masters. So pay attention, everybody. Of course.
Yeah, it's a good one. Sorry.
Leaders Eat Last also talks about teams, because leaders are there because there are teams, right? This is where it all starts, and teams are the topic of our next conversation, Andrew. So do share with us a story of a team. Tell us a little bit about the context so that we may know, what kind of project it was, how big the team was, and so on. And then walk us through the steps of how those small things, little behaviors started to develop over time and eventually created big problems for the team.
Yeah, there's a team that I started working with, and I worked with them for about 2 years, and a great group of individuals. When I joined, they'd already had kind of an impression in the organization that they were not a high-performing team, and they were already kind of deep into the anti-patterns that I think are quite common in teams. They, for example, spent a lot of time refining stories. They wanted stories to be so detailed that they were almost requirement technical specifications. Yet if they got too detailed, they got annoyed at the product owner for not giving them an opportunity to be creative. They would spend 30, 40 minutes sometimes refining in refinement meetings, discussing the story, trying to figure out all the details and all the critical paths. And then the QA person who felt solely responsible for quality, there's an anti-pattern. The quality is not solely on the one person, but he felt solely on it. So he would spend time in the refinement going into unlikely cases that might happen, really deep edge cases. And really that's not what the conversation is supposed to be about. And because of this, we had internal conflict between engineers and QA. The product owner was often frustrated, and it just kind of led to a team, again, that didn't have a high level of trust. This sounds similar to the team I talked about on the Monday episode, but it actually is a different team. So that team was really going down a deep dark hole. I remember often in daily scrums, they would end up in very frustrating conversations and arguments. And I remember one day the QA person just walked away because the conflict was too high. So they had really kind of high levels of unhealthy conflict that just kind of kept escalating.
And what can you tell us a little bit more about what might have been like the beginning of that? Because the I want to have all the details in the user story anti-pattern is something I'm very familiar with. In fact, there's a lot of teams that have that anti-pattern, and it starts from a good place, right? Like they want to not do a lot of rework. They want to know what kind of things should happen with this particular edge case. Or I remember even in one case where a team was complaining that the product owner doesn't listen to us. That's why the details are not there. If they would just listen to us, then the details would be there. And of course, that speaks to other things, right? Like it speaks to expectations from both sides, both the product owner and the team and so on. But in that particular team that you're talking about, like what were the things that might have triggered this approach?
I think there's a couple things. First, the organization was early in an agile transformation, so I think they had worked in a bit more of a waterfall type process before I had arrived on that team, and they were used to the detailed requirements analysis being done up front and being passed to that team. Secondly, again, I think engineers felt judged by bugs. Therefore, they didn't want to have any bugs. That reflected poorly on the individual and not necessarily the team or the process. And of course, the QA person, felt solely responsible for quality. So he had a very siloed team, even though it was only a team of about six people. But the team kind of felt siloed in its roles, and as you would see in a kind of a traditional waterfall type project. So those kind of led to those anti-patterns and people protecting their own turf and protecting their own image and reputation in the organization.
And that's something that I see quite often happens because of like even simple things like a difference in expectations, right? Like I expect something, you expect something else, and then because you happen to be the QA or the engineer and I'm the other one, then we start creating this animosity that is kind of, maybe we could call it role centered. Mm-hmm. Even though what we are trying to do is something that can only be done together, right? Like on the face of it, if you look at it logically, there's no sense for us to be arguing because we're actually trying to develop the same thing. But still this anti-pattern kind of develops. Now you have, of course, now also a lot more experience. So when you see this kind of anti-pattern develop, like what are the things you do and of course could recommend for us should we find such an environment?
Yeah, in fact, with this team, I mean, I've had similar experiences. With this team, I managed to help them go from a low-performing team to a high-performing team. A couple things that we did. I really worked on the concept of shared accountability. And I let them know, by the way, that the shared accountability included me. So one of the problems with this team is that when there were bugs, leadership would come after the team and come after the individuals. And I stepped in front of that a couple of times and be like, no, you know what? Let's not go after this individual. This team is together. So they saw that they could trust me to be a shield for them, which was important. The second thing, actually, gets story refinement was a real problem, and it was around that time that I was doing professional Scrum with Kanban and also reading your book around NoEstimates, and I got the team away from having to be exactly accurate on their estimating process. I actually moved them to t-shirt sizing, and because I believe when teams are fighting about the difference between a 5 and an 8, they're debating how much risk or uncertainty there is in a thing. So I just got us to like, hey, let's size things to think we can get done in a couple of weeks, and we'll roll forward with that and use other metrics. But that simple thing just completely changed the conversation around when we were refining stories, led to better conversations, led to the team being able to just focus on the problem they wanted to solve, not on getting it 100% right in the story. And those little things, with some others, just kind of move the team forward to a really healthy place.
And this actually is an example of how sometimes very small changes of focus can totally eliminate certain anti-patterns. Somebody, I don't remember who said in a video that I watched that we don't choose what comes to our mind and what happens around us, but we choose where we put our focus. But where do we choose to spend our thinking time, right? Or what things do we choose to spend our thinking time? And this topic of slicing and looking for the small things that we can do is a great example. So rather than thinking about all of the details, if we just discuss what is the problem we're trying to solve, right? Like what is the user trying to achieve that they can't yet? And how can we make it simple or simpler for them? And I think that conversation is going to take energy away from the details, inevitably. But also, it puts the responsibility, as you said, on the team, like the shared responsibility of delivering something. Because once we understand the problem, we can actually collaborate on a solution.
Yeah, I totally agree. And one of the things that kind of related to that was we also allowed the team to help the team focus on what we were trying to do with the product. We were in a healthcare setting where we were started to focus on not just building software, but helping patients, which was really important to our organization, and giving that kind of shared vision of what we're actually doing instead of focusing on the minute details of exactly how a piece of code should be written and how it should be tested was really important.
And that's a great message. That's what we do software, is to help people achieve something, not to deliver software.
100%. Yeah, you need to be delivering something valuable to somebody.
Great story. Thank you for sharing that, Andrew.
Thank you.
Tuesday is Team Day here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. But tomorrow we talk about something that goes beyond the work we do with the teams. We will talk about how to lead change and what our guests have learned from leading and participating in change programs during their career. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.